It was strange how a room designed for comfort could feel so cold the moment someone decided you didn't belong there, and even stranger that the one person being judged the most harshly was the only one who actually owned the power everyone else was pretending to protect. At exactly 10:14 a.m., inside the polished marble lobby of the Grand Horizon Hotel, Naomi Whittaker stood still while the air around her tightened like a drawn wire, not because of what she had done, but because of what others believed she couldn't be. She wasn't dressed to impress, no designer labels, no entourage, just a fitted black coat over a simple blouse and dark jeans, the kind of outfit that made people assume instead of ask, and in a place where perception passed for truth, that assumption was already writing her story without her permission. Behind the front desk, Ethan Caldwell leaned forward with the kind of confidence that came from thinking you understood the room better than anyone else, his tone clipped, controlled, and just loud enough for nearby guests to hear as he questioned her reservation like it was a mistake that needed correcting rather than a fact that needed verifying. Naomi didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, didn't match his energy, and that was the part that unsettled him most, because people who knew they were in the wrong usually tried to prove otherwise, but people who knew exactly who they were didn't need to prove anything at all. Around them, the lobby began to shift, subtle at first, a businessman pausing mid-step, a couple lowering their voices, a concierge glancing up from her screen with a hesitation that suggested she had seen something like this before but wasn't sure if this was the moment to speak. Ethan continued, doubling down on procedure, on policy, on the invisible rules that somehow only applied to certain people, and with every word he spoke, the space between assumption and truth grew wider, more obvious, more uncomfortable. Naomi's eyes moved once across the room, not searching for help, not seeking validation, but taking inventory, noting the cameras, the exits, the people watching, the ones who looked away, and the few who didn't, her silence not empty but deliberate, like she was allowing something to unfold exactly as it needed to. A phone appeared in someone's hand near the lounge chairs, not raised high, just enough to capture what was happening without announcing it, because even without understanding the full story, there was a shared instinct in the room that something about this didn't sit right. Ethan's voice sharpened again, pressing harder, pushing the moment forward as if control could be forced into existence, and still Naomi didn't move, didn't step back, didn't shrink into the version of herself he seemed to expect. She simply stood there, composed, grounded, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond this lobby, beyond his authority, beyond the fragile illusion of power that came from standing behind a desk. And that was the paradox no one in the room could quite name yet. The person being treated like she had the least right to be there was the only one who didn't need permission at all. 10 minutes earlier, before the tension had a name, before anyone in the lobby realized they were about to witness something that would not be forgotten, Naomi Whittaker had walked through the revolving glass doors without hesitation, without announcement, and without the slightest need to prove anything to anyone inside that building. The sunlight from outside followed her in for just a second, catching the clean lines of the marble floor and the polished brass fixtures before the doors sealed shut behind her, leaving her in a space that looked perfect on the surface and carefully controlled underneath. She did not slow down to admire the architecture or glance at the decorative arrangements that were clearly designed to impress, because she had seen versions of this same lobby across the country, some better, some worse, all claiming the same standard of excellence that only a few ever actually delivered. Her steps were measured and quiet, the soft echo of her shoes barely noticeable against the hum of distant conversations and rolling luggage, yet there was a presence in the way she moved that did not ask for attention but inevitably drew it anyway. A bellman near the entrance glanced at her briefly, then looked away just as quickly, already categorizing her in his mind without realizing it, while two guests seated near the lounge area paused their conversation for a fraction of a second before continuing, their interest fading as quickly as it appeared. At the front desk, Ethan Caldwell had been reviewing a report on his tablet. His posture straight, his expression set in the kind of practiced authority that came from managing expectations rather than questioning them, and when Naomi approached, he did not greet her with the warmth reserved for high-value guests, nor with the neutrality expected for everyone else, but with something more selective, something already shaped by an assumption he had not yet spoken out loud. Naomi placed her identification and confirmation details on the counter with a calm precision, her voice even as she stated her name and the reservation she was there to claim, not asking, not negotiating, simply informing. For a brief moment, there was a pause, the kind that could have gone either way, the kind where a single decision determines whether a situation resolves quietly or begins to unravel. Ethan looked down at the information, then back at her, and in that glance something shifted, not in her, but in him, as if he had already decided the answer before verifying the facts. Naomi noticed it immediately, not because it was new, but because it was familiar, the subtle tightening of the jaw, the slight change in tone, the invisible line being drawn without justification. She had seen it in conference rooms, in board meetings, in places where her credentials had been questioned not directly, but through hesitation and doubt disguised as due diligence. And now she was seeing it again, here, in a hotel that carried her company's name, in a space that operated under standards she had personally helped define. She did not react to it, did not correct it, did not interrupt the process as it began to tilt in a direction she already recognized, because sometimes the clearest way to reveal a system is to let it run exactly as it is designed. Behind the desk, Ethan's fingers hovered over the screen a second longer than necessary, his silence stretching just enough to signal that this was no longer a routine check-in, and around them, the lobby continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that in just a few moments, everything about that space would feel very different. The hesitation did not last long, but it lasted long enough to reveal everything that mattered because Ethan Caldwell did not begin by confirming her reservation, he began by questioning her presence, and that difference was not procedural, it was personal. He lifted his gaze from the screen and let it rest on Naomi Whittaker for a second too long, as if searching for something that would justify what he was about to say, and when he finally spoke, his tone carried a quiet certainty that sounded less like inquiry and more like a verdict already decided. He asked her to repeat her name, not because he had not heard it, but because he needed to hear it again in a way that would allow him to challenge it, and Naomi repeated it without emphasis, without defense, simply stating Naomi Whittaker with the same calm clarity as before. Ethan glanced back at the system, his fingers tapping lightly against the tablet, then he shook his head just slightly, a gesture so small it could have been mistaken for routine, except it was not routine, it was dismissal beginning to take shape. He said there did not appear to be a valid reservation under that name for the suite she had requested, and he said it in a tone that suggested the matter was already closed unless she could prove otherwise. Naomi did not reach for her phone immediately, did not argue, did not rush to correct him, because she understood something that most people in that moment did not, which was that the truth was already in the system, and the system was not failing, it was being filtered. Around them, the subtle shift in attention grew stronger. A man in a grey suit paused near the elevators pretending to check his watch while clearly listening. A woman seated by the window lowered her coffee cup slowly, her eyes fixed on the exchange, and behind the concierge desk, a young employee hesitated as if debating whether to step in or stay silent. Ethan continued, asking Naomi if she had confirmation details, but the way he asked made it clear that he expected the answer to fall short, as though he had already decided what kind of guest she was before verifying anything at all. Naomi slid the printed confirmation across the counter, the paper crisp, the information clear, her movements precise, controlled, leaving no room for confusion, yet Ethan did not reach for it right away, and that pause said more than any words could. When he finally took the document, he glanced at it quickly, not with the attention of someone verifying facts, but with the skepticism of someone looking for inconsistencies, and when he did not immediately find one, his expression tightened just enough to show that the situation was not unfolding the way he expected. He said the document could not be confirmed on his end and that there might be an issue with the booking source, suggesting without saying it outright that it might not be legitimate, and in that moment, the line between procedure and assumption disappeared completely. Naomi met his gaze for the first time since the exchange began, not with anger, not with frustration, but with a steady, unshaken focus that seemed to ask a question without words, a question about why verification had turned into suspicion and why a simple check-in had become something else entirely. Ethan did not answer that question, not directly, but his next move made it clear, because instead of resolving the issue quietly, he shifted his stance, straightened his posture, and raised his voice just enough for others to hear, turning a private interaction into a public situation. He said he would need to verify her identity further before allowing access to any premium room, emphasizing the word premium in a way that suggested she had not earned the right to request it, and as those words settled into the air, the atmosphere in the lobby changed again, no longer neutral, no longer routine, but charged with something heavier, something that could no longer be mistaken for a simple misunderstanding. The moment Ethan raised his voice, the lobby stopped pretending not to notice, because there is a specific tone that does not belong in places like this, a tone that turns service into spectacle and quietly invites everyone nearby to become part of something they did not ask to witness. Naomi Whittaker did not turn toward the growing attention, but she felt it, the subtle shift in posture from the guests around her, the way conversation softened and then disappeared entirely, the way movement slowed as if the room itself was holding its breath. A man near the reception area adjusted his jacket but did not walk away. A couple standing beside their luggage exchanged a glance that carried more understanding than words, and across the lobby, a woman seated near the lounge lifted her phone just slightly, not high enough to be obvious, but enough to capture what was unfolding in real time. Behind the concierge desk, the young employee who had hesitated earlier now looked directly at the screen in front of her, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if she was searching for something that might confirm what she suspected but had not yet said aloud. Ethan, however, did not notice the shift in the room or chose to ignore it, because his focus remained locked on maintaining control of the moment, and control, once challenged, often demands escalation. He stepped slightly to the side, positioning himself more squarely between Naomi and the rest of the desk, a subtle physical barrier that suggested she would not be moving forward without his approval, and when he spoke again, his words carried the weight of authority he believed he held. He said that without proper verification, he could not allow access to restricted areas of the hotel, emphasizing that these spaces were reserved for high-tier guests, and the implication settled heavily in the air, not stated directly, but clearly understood by everyone listening. Naomi's expression did not change, but there was a stillness in her posture that felt different now, less passive, more deliberate, as if she had reached a point where observation was no longer about understanding the situation but about allowing it to fully reveal itself. She glanced once toward the concierge desk, just long enough to catch the eye of the young employee, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that truth existed somewhere in the system even if it was being ignored at the surface. The employee swallowed, then looked back at her screen, her fingers finally moving, quietly navigating through internal records, her hesitation turning into cautious action. Meanwhile, the phone in the lounge area was no longer hidden as carefully, its angle adjusted to capture both Naomi and Ethan clearly, and a second device appeared from another guest standing closer to the entrance, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the unmistakable sense that something about this interaction was wrong. Ethan continued speaking, layering justification over assumption, repeating terms like verification and policy as if repetition could transform bias into procedure, but the more he spoke, the more visible the gap became between what he claimed and what was actually happening. Naomi remained where she was, grounded, composed, her silence no longer neutral but purposeful, and in that silence, the room began to lean, slowly but undeniably, away from the authority behind the desk and toward the woman who had yet to raise her voice, because even without knowing who she was, they could feel something that did not align, something that made the polished surface of the lobby feel suddenly fragile, like a stage where the script had started to fall apart. By the time Ethan Caldwell spoke again, the word policy had become less of a guideline and more of a shield, something he held up not to clarify the situation but to control it, and the way he used it carried a quiet finality, as if invoking that word alone was enough to end the discussion. He explained that until every detail could be verified through the proper channels, Naomi Whittaker would not be granted access to any suite, especially not one at the highest tier, and the emphasis he placed on highest tier was deliberate, drawing a line that did not need to be visible to be felt. Naomi did not interrupt him, did not challenge the phrasing, but her gaze remained steady, fixed on him with a calm that seemed to strip away the weight of his words rather than absorb them. There was no confusion in her expression, no sign that she was questioning her own position, only a quiet recognition of exactly what was happening and why. Ethan reached for her identification again, this time not to confirm it but to hold it, keeping it just out of reach on the counter as if possession alone gave him authority over the situation. And when Naomi extended her hand slightly, not demanding but expecting its return, he did not respond to the gesture, choosing instead to continue speaking about procedure, about standards, about protecting the integrity of the hotel. Around them, the shift in the room became more pronounced, the subtle tension evolving into something heavier, more defined, as if the air itself had thickened with unspoken understanding. The young concierge behind the desk finally found what she was looking for, her eyes widening just slightly as the reservation details appeared on her screen, clear, verified, and marked with a level of access that did not match the narrative unfolding at the front desk, but she hesitated again, her loyalty to protocol clashing with what she now knew to be true. A guest near the entrance stepped a little closer, no longer pretending to be uninvolved, his attention fixed on the exchange with a quiet intensity, while the phones that had once been discreet were now held with less caution, the moment too significant to ignore. Ethan, still unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the shift, leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled but not enough to remain private, and suggested that if Naomi could not provide immediate verification beyond what he had already dismissed, it might be best for her to step aside and allow other guests to check in. The suggestion was framed as practical, even courteous, but the implication was unmistakable, that she was an interruption, a problem to be moved out of the way rather than a guest to be served. Naomi's posture did not change, but something in her stillness deepened, as if she had reached a point where the outcome was no longer uncertain, where the pattern had completed itself and all that remained was to let it be seen clearly. She spoke for the first time since he had taken control of the conversation, her voice low, even, and precise, asking a single question about whether he had actually checked the system or simply decided not to trust what it showed, and the question did not carry accusation, only clarity, but it landed with more weight than anything said before. Ethan did not answer it directly, and in that silence, the word policy lost whatever authority it had left, revealing itself not as a rule but as a choice, and a choice that was becoming increasingly difficult to defend in a room that was no longer willing to look away. The shift happened not in a sudden burst but in a tightening of everything at once, like a moment stretching longer than it should, where every person in the lobby felt the line being crossed even if no one had said it out loud yet. Ethan Caldwell's hand remained on the counter near Naomi Whittaker's identification, his posture rigid, his authority no longer just asserted but defended, and in that defense there was something sharper now, something less controlled than before. Naomi took a small step forward, not aggressive, not rushed, simply closing the space enough to reach for what belonged to her, her movement calm, measured, entirely reasonable in a situation that had already drifted far from reasonable. For a fraction of a second, their hands came close to the same point on the polished surface, and that was where the moment changed, not because of what happened physically, but because of what it represented. Ethan reacted, not with clarity, but with impulse, pulling back slightly and raising his voice in a way that no longer carried professionalism, only frustration, telling her to step back, to give space, to follow instructions as if compliance had become the only acceptable outcome. The words landed harder than they should have, not because of volume, but because of tone, and the room felt it immediately, the difference between authority and overreach becoming impossible to ignore. Naomi did not step back. She did not argue. She simply stood her ground, her hand lowering slowly back to her side, her expression unchanged, but there was something different now, something resolved, as if a quiet line had been drawn within her that would not be crossed again. Around them, the witnesses who had been uncertain were no longer uncertain, the phones that had been half hidden were now steady, focused, capturing not just a disagreement but a pattern unfolding in real time. The young concierge behind the desk looked from her screen to Naomi, then to Ethan, her hesitation breaking as the truth in the system and the reality in front of her collided too clearly to ignore, but before she could speak, Ethan moved again, repositioning himself, placing his body more firmly between Naomi and the desk, reinforcing the barrier he had already created. His words came faster now, layered with justification, with insistence, repeating that without proper clearance, without his approval, nothing moved forward, and yet every repetition made it less convincing, not more. Naomi's eyes held his for a moment longer, not challenging, not retreating, simply present, and in that presence there was a weight that did not match the role he had assigned to her. The room was no longer neutral. It was no longer divided. It was leaning, quietly but unmistakably, toward a truth that had not yet been spoken but was already understood, that this was no longer about a reservation, no longer about procedure, but about a choice being made in real time, a choice that would not stay contained within the walls of that lobby once it was fully revealed. Silence settled over the lobby in a way that felt heavier than noise, because when tension reaches a certain point, it no longer needs volume to be understood, it simply exists in the air, pressing against every person in the room, demanding acknowledgement. Naomi Whittaker did not move, not immediately, not even after the last exchange had clearly shifted the atmosphere beyond anything that could be called routine, and in that stillness, something inside her shifted instead. It was not visible to anyone else, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would draw attention, but it was there, a quiet turning point that had nothing to do with the present moment and everything to do with a memory she had carried for years. For a brief second, the polished marble floor beneath her feet was no longer this lobby, it was another one, smaller, less refined, but familiar in a way that had never quite left her. She was younger then, barely out of high school, standing in a borrowed blazer that did not quite fit, holding documents she had triple-checked, believing that preparation alone would be enough to earn respect. She remembered the way the receptionist had looked at her, not unkind, but dismissive, as if her presence required explanation, as if belonging had to be proven before it could be granted. She remembered being told there was an issue with her booking, that she should step aside, that someone would assist her later, and she remembered waiting, not minutes, but hours, watching others arrive after her and move ahead without question, without delay, without scrutiny. Back then, she had said nothing, had accepted the explanation even when it did not make sense, because she did not yet understand that silence, when misinterpreted, can be mistaken for agreement. The memory did not linger long, but it did not need to, because its purpose was not to bring back frustration, it was to remind her of the distance she had traveled and the reason she had never allowed moments like that to define her. When the present returned fully, it did so with clarity, not emotion, and Naomi's expression remained composed, unchanged, but there was a depth behind it now that had not been there before, something settled, something final. Around her, the lobby remained still, the witnesses no longer shifting or whispering, but watching. Fully aware that whatever happened next would not simply resolve the situation, it would define it. The young concierge looked up again, this time with certainty instead of hesitation, the information on her screen no longer something she questioned but something she knew, and she took a small step forward, her voice quiet but steady as she began to speak, ready to confirm what the system had already made clear. Ethan Caldwell turned slightly at the movement, his attention pulled just enough to register that something was changing beyond his control, and in that fraction of a moment, the balance of the room tilted, not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably. Naomi did not need to raise her voice, did not need to demand recognition, because the truth was no longer something she had to introduce, it was something that was beginning to surface on its own, and as it did, the weight of every assumption made in the last few minutes grew heavier, no longer abstract, but real, measurable, and impossible to ignore. The first voice did not rise loudly, but it cut through the tension with a clarity that shifted everything, because it did not come from a place of authority, it came from a place of truth. The young concierge stepped forward just enough to be heard, her hand steady now, her hesitation gone as she spoke directly to Ethan Caldwell, saying that the reservation was in the system, fully verified, and marked with executive-level clearance, her words precise, careful, but undeniable. For a brief second, the room held still again, not with uncertainty this time, but with recognition, as if a line that had been invisible moments ago had suddenly been drawn in plain sight. Ethan turned toward her, his expression tightening, not because he had not heard her, but because what she said did not fit the version of events he had already committed to, and instead of accepting it, he questioned her, his tone sharper now, asking if she was certain, if she had checked properly, if she understood the level of access she was referring to. The concierge did not step back, did not lower her voice, and repeated it again, this time with more confidence, confirming that the name Naomi Whitaker was attached to one of the highest-level reservations in the system, complete with internal notes that required no additional verification. Around them, the shift became visible, not just felt, as the guests who had been watching began to react, a man near the elevators shaking his head slightly, a woman by the lounge lowering her phone just enough to speak under her breath about what she was seeing, and another guest stepping closer without even realizing it, drawn in by the weight of the moment. Naomi did not speak yet, did not interrupt, but her presence filled the space in a way that made everything else feel smaller, because now the truth was no longer something she had to introduce, it was something someone else had confirmed. Ethan's grip on the situation began to slip, not dramatically, not in a way that caused immediate collapse, but in subtle fractures, the kind that spread quietly until they could no longer be contained. He glanced back at his tablet, tapping through screens with more urgency than before, searching not for information, but for something that would support his earlier stance, something that would allow him to maintain control without admitting he had been wrong. But the system did not change for him, and the more he searched, the more obvious it became that the issue had never been the reservation, it had been his refusal to trust it. The phones in the room were no longer discreet, now openly recording, capturing not just a disagreement, but the moment a narrative unraveled in front of witnesses who could no longer pretend they did not see it. Naomi finally shifted slightly, not forward, not backward, just enough to realign herself with the center of the space, her posture calm, her gaze steady, as if acknowledging the truth now visible in the room without needing to claim it as her own. And in that moment, the balance tipped completely, because what had started as one person being questioned had become a room full of people questioning the one who had assumed he held the authority to decide who belonged and who did not. Naomi Whittaker did not rush to speak after the truth surfaced, because she understood something most people in that room were only beginning to realize, that once a system exposes itself, the most powerful move is not to interrupt it, but to let it keep revealing what it was always designed to hide. She reached into her coat slowly, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that naturally drew it, retrieving her phone with the same calm precision she had shown since the moment she walked in. Ethan Caldwell watched the movement closely, his posture still rigid but no longer confident, because control had already started slipping from his hands, even if he had not fully admitted it yet. Naomi unlocked the screen and held it for a second, not looking down, but looking at him, as if giving him one last opportunity to correct course before everything escalated beyond his reach. He said nothing. That silence was all she needed. She turned slightly, angling the phone just enough to hear clearly, and made a call, her voice low, steady, and unmistakably direct as she spoke the name of her executive assistant, not with urgency, but with expectation. She said it was time to initiate a full internal review of the Grand Horizon property, referencing protocol in a way that sounded nothing like Ethan's earlier attempts to use the word, because hers was not defensive, it was decisive. On the other end, the response came immediately, confirming activation of internal systems, pulling reservation logs, access records, and security footage, all tied to the name Naomi Whittaker, all tied to the exact moment unfolding in that lobby. Around them, the room seemed to lean in further, the guests no longer just observers, but witnesses to something far more significant than a disagreement at a front desk. The concierge who had spoken earlier stepped back slightly, her role no longer to reveal the truth, but to watch it unfold, her expression shifting from concern to quiet understanding. Ethan's eyes moved between Naomi and the devices in his hands, his fingers tapping faster now, checking, rechecking, as if speed could somehow rewrite what was already confirmed. Naomi continued speaking into the phone, her words measured, requesting that all current managerial access for the location be flagged for immediate review, that all recent guest complaints tied to verification disputes be surfaced, and that legal be placed on standby. She did not raise her voice. She did not explain herself to the room. She simply spoke as someone accustomed to being heard without needing to justify why. The effect was immediate, not because of volume, but because of certainty, the kind that does not come from authority being claimed, but from authority already established. Ethan finally spoke again, attempting to regain footing, questioning who she was calling, what she thought she was doing, but the question sounded thinner now, less like challenges and more like reactions to something he could no longer control. Naomi ended the call without ceremony and lowered the phone, her gaze returning to him with the same calm clarity as before, but now the room saw it differently, because it was no longer just composure, it was command. And in that moment, the shift was complete, because what had started as one person being questioned had become a system being activated, one that did not rely on opinions, assumptions, or tone, but on records, authority, and truth that could no longer be ignored. Even after the call ended and the weight of it settled into the room, Ethan Caldwell did not step back, because for people like him, the moment when control begins to slip is often the moment they push hardest to hold onto it, even when every signal around them is telling them to stop. He let out a short breath, almost a scoff, and shook his head slightly as if dismissing everything that had just happened, his voice rising again, louder now, sharper, insisting that whatever call Naomi Whittaker had just made did not change the situation in front of him. He said that until he personally verified her identity through his own process, nothing she claimed or implied carried any weight in that lobby, and the emphasis he placed on personally was no longer about procedure, it was about authority he refused to release. The room reacted differently this time, not with uncertainty, but with visible discomfort, because the line had already been crossed and everyone knew it, even if Ethan continued to act as if it had not. A guest near the elevators spoke quietly to someone beside him, shaking his head in disbelief, while another person near the lounge area lowered their phone just long enough to whisper that this was going too far. The young concierge behind the desk did not look down at her screen anymore. She looked directly at Ethan, her expression no longer hesitant but firm, as if she had reached the same conclusion as everyone else in the room. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but now there was a clarity in the way she looked at him, not questioning, not waiting, but observing the final steps of a decision he was making for himself. Ethan took another step forward, closing the space again, his words coming faster, more defensive, suggesting that guests who could not follow standard procedures were often the ones attempting to manipulate the system, and as soon as the sentence left his mouth, the reaction in the room was immediate, not loud, but unmistakable, a collective shift that no longer supported him. Naomi's gaze did not waver, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, measured, and impossibly controlled for the weight of the moment, asking him one simple question: whether he understood the difference between protecting a system and misusing it. The question did not sound like a challenge, it sounded like a conclusion, and it landed with more force than anything raised in volume. Ethan hesitated for the first time, just a fraction of a second, but enough for the room to feel it, enough for the illusion of certainty to crack. He tried to recover, repeating that he was following protocol, that he was doing his job, but the words no longer held the same authority they had minutes ago, because now everyone had seen what that version of protocol actually looked like in practice. Naomi did not interrupt him again. She did not need to. The system she had activated was already moving, already documenting, already connecting every word and every action to something far beyond that front desk. And in that moment, the balance of power was no longer something being debated, it was something being revealed in real time. With every second Ethan chose to continue, only making that revelation more complete, more undeniable, and far more permanent than he seemed to understand. The moment did not arrive with a shout or a dramatic reveal, it arrived in a voice that refused to rise, because true authority does not need volume to be heard. Naomi Whittaker looked directly at Ethan Caldwell, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and when she spoke, she did not rush, she did not hesitate, she simply stated what had always been true: her name, her position, and the role she held over everything he had tried to control in that lobby. She said she was the chief executive officer of the parent company that owned the Grand Horizon Hotel, the one responsible for the standards he claimed to protect, the one whose systems he had questioned, and the one whose presence he had spent the last several minutes refusing to recognize. The word settled into the room like weight, not explosive, not chaotic, but absolute, and for a brief second, nothing moved, not the guests, not the staff, not even Ethan, whose expression shifted in a way that could not be hidden, the certainty he had carried now replaced by something far less stable. Around them, the reaction spread quietly but unmistakably, a low murmur passing through the lobby as understanding caught up with what had just been said. The phones that had been recording now held even steadier, capturing not just the conflict, but the turning point that redefined it entirely. The young concierge lowered her gaze for a moment, not in doubt, but in realization, as the pieces aligned perfectly with what she had seen in the system, and the guests who had been watching exchanged looks that needed no explanation, because the situation had just shifted from questionable to undeniable. Ethan opened his mouth as if to respond, but the words did not come immediately, and in that hesitation, the entire structure of his authority unraveled, because the foundation it had been built on had never been as solid as he believed. Naomi did not press him, did not demand acknowledgement, because she did not need it, and that absence of demand carried more power than any insistence could have. She continued, her voice still calm, still measured, stating that everything that had taken place in that lobby had already been logged, recorded, and reviewed in real time, not just by her, but by the executive systems that governed the entire organization. She did not accuse him directly, she did not list his actions one by one, because she did not need to. The room had already witnessed enough, and the systems she had activated would handle the rest with a precision that did not rely on emotion or interpretation. Ethan finally found his voice, but it sounded different now, lower, uncertain, as if he was trying to recalibrate in a situation that no longer responded to him, and he asked a question that revealed more than he intended, asking if she was serious, if this was some kind of misunderstanding, but even as he said it, the answer was already clear. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, then spoke one final sentence, not raised, not emphasized, but delivered with a clarity that left no room for doubt, telling him that the issue had never been whether she belonged there, it was how he chose to treat someone he believed did not, and as those words settled into the space between them, the room no longer felt like a lobby, it felt like a verdict already reached, waiting only for the system she had set in motion to make it official. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty, it felt conclusive, as if the room itself had already accepted what was about to happen next even before it began. Naomi Whittaker did not move, did not shift her stance, because she did not need to reposition herself in a space that had already realigned around her, and for the first time since she walked in, no one questioned her presence, not with their eyes, not with their posture, not even with their silence. Ethan Caldwell stood where he was, but the space around him had changed, the authority he once occupied now hollow, unsupported, as if the structure beneath it had been quietly removed without him noticing. Then it happened, not with a loud interruption, but with a subtle change that only those closest to the desk caught at first, the screen in front of Ethan flickering as system notifications began to appear, one after another, small alerts that carried far more weight than their size suggested. His access credentials flagged, his permissions temporarily suspended pending review, internal audit protocols initiated under executive authorization, each line of text precise, unemotional, and final in a way that no argument could reverse. He stared at the screen, his fingers hovering but no longer moving, because there was nothing left to control, nothing left to override, only the system responding exactly as it was designed to when triggered by the highest level of authority. Around the lobby, the shift became visible in real time, the guests who had been watching now standing a little straighter, some lowering their phones not because the moment had ended, but because it had reached its conclusion, while others continued recording, understanding that what they were witnessing was no longer unfolding, it was being executed. The young concierge took a small step back from the desk, her role no longer uncertain, her expression calm as she watched the system confirm what she had already known, that the truth did not need to be defended, only allowed to surface. Naomi's phone vibrated once in her hand, a brief confirmation from the other end, and she glanced down for just a second, reading the update without reaction, then looked back up, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, because for her, this was not escalation, it was resolution. Ethan finally spoke, but his voice had lost its sharpness, replaced by something quieter, strained, asking what was happening to his system, as if it still belonged to him, as if the control he had assumed was ever his to begin with. Naomi answered simply, her tone even, explaining that what he was seeing was the result of a full compliance review initiated in response to his actions, not as a punishment driven by emotion, but as a process designed to protect the integrity he had claimed to uphold. She did not raise her voice, did not emphasize the outcome, because the system was already doing that for her, each notification a confirmation, each restriction a consequence, each second removing any remaining doubt about where the authority in that room truly resided. And as the final alert appeared, confirming that his access had been fully suspended pending formal review, the lobby settled into a new kind of quiet, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved, because justice had not arrived with noise or confrontation, it had arrived exactly as it should have, through a system that responded to truth, and a woman who never needed to raise her voice to make it happen. No one in the lobby spoke immediately after the final notification settled on the screen, because moments like that do not invite reaction, they demand reflection, and for the first time since this began, the space felt aligned with something deeper than service or status, it felt aligned with truth. Naomi Whittaker remained where she stood, not elevated above the room, not separated from it, but centered within it, her presence no longer questioned, no longer measured against appearance or assumption, but understood for what it had always been. Ethan Caldwell did not move right away, his eyes still fixed on the screen in front of him, as if staring long enough might reverse what had already been decided, but the system did not bend, it did not reconsider, it simply reflected the consequences of choices made in plain view. Around them, the guests began to shift again, not with curiosity this time, but with quiet acknowledgement, a man near the elevators nodding once as if confirming something he already believed, a woman by the lounge lowering her phone completely, her expression thoughtful rather than reactive, because what she had witnessed was no longer just a moment, it was a message. The young concierge straightened slightly behind the desk, her posture no longer uncertain, her voice calm as she addressed Naomi with a level of respect that matched the truth now fully visible, asking if she would like assistance completing her check-in, not as a correction of the past few minutes, but as a return to what should have been done from the beginning. Naomi turned toward her, her expression softening just slightly, not in relief, not in victory, but in recognition, and she nodded once, accepting the offer without drawing attention to the shift, because for her, this was never about proving a point, it was about restoring a standard. Before stepping forward, she looked back at Ethan one last time, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a clarity that carried more weight than either, and when she spoke, her voice remained steady, her words measured, telling him that the issue had never been about a reservation, or a system, or even a single moment in a lobby. It was about the decisions people make when they believe no one is watching, and how those decisions define the environments they claim to represent. She did not wait for a response, because none was required, and she did not linger in the space where the mistake had been made, because she had already ensured it would not be repeated the same way again. As she moved toward the desk, the lobby seemed to settle into a new rhythm, quieter, more aware, as if every person present had just witnessed something that would stay with them longer than they expected. And as Naomi completed what she had originally come to do, without urgency, without disruption, the message left behind did not need to be spoken again, because it was already understood that dignity does not announce itself. It reveals itself, and when it does, it has the power to transform not just a moment, but the standard by which every moment after it will be judged.